Okay, I think we'll make a start. We've got about best part of 100 people joined us tonight. I'm Al Thomson from the History program at Monash University, and delighted to welcome you to tonight's Making Public History's webinar, where I'll be in conversation with Anna Clark about her book, Making Australian History. Let me start by acknowledging the original Indigenous custodians of the land where I'm speaking from, which is Wurundjeri country, the northern suburbs of Melbourne, and pay respect to elders past, present and emerging. These Making Public History webinars started in 2008, and they're a collaboration between the History program at Monash University, the History Council of Victoria and Old Treasury Building. And tonight, supporting me are my colleagues Alistair Thomson from the History Council of Victoria and Margie Anderson from Old Treasury Building. The aims of the Making Public History webinars are really to explore the ways in which histories get made, interpreted, contested in a range of different media, and how and why they matter. And when Anna's book came out, it seemed like an entirely appropriate focus for one of our webinars. So really delighted that Anna was able agree to join us. Let me just explain, probably by now you're all pretty familiar with webinars, but in case you're not, only the presenters and the hosts can be seen and heard. We're going to start with a conversation between myself and Anna for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have 35-40 minutes of Q&A. If you've got questions, use the Q&A bottom that you'll find at the bottom of your screen. You can do that at any time while Anna and I are talking, and you can also do it again during the Q&A. And my colleague Alicia Soretto is going to join Anna to host the Q&A after the conversation finishes. If you've got any technical problems, use the chat button, and Margie Anderson's going to be keeping an eye on that and hopefully helping out if you have any tech problems. Just in case either myself or Anna, if our internet connection gets a bit wobbly, then we may continue voice only, but hopefully we won't have to do that. And I need to tell you, we're recording this webinar tonight. The recording will be available on the History Council of Victoria website in a few days' time. And when you're putting a question in, if you don't want to be named, if Alicia reads out your question, then you can use the anonymous function, or just say so in the question. Otherwise, nice to know who's asking the questions. Of course, keep your questions polite and respectful. So let me stop sharing the slides now, and give me 2 seconds. Okay. And look, I'm delighted to welcome Anna Clark. Let me just briefly introduce Anna. Anna's an Australian Research Council Future Fellow in Public History at the University of Technology, Sydney. She's the author of Making Australian History, published this year by Penguin, which is the focus of our conversation tonight. Anna's written extensively on history education, historiography and historical consciousness, including her books in 2006, Teaching the Nation, Politics and Pedagogy in Australian History. In 2008, History's Children, History Wars in the Classroom. In 2016, Private Lives, Public History. And in 2003, The History Wars, which she wrote with the late and lamented Stuart Macintyre. Anna's also written 2 history books for children, which I didn't know about, and I'm looking forward to reading, Convicted and Explored. And reflecting her love of fish and fishing, in 2017, she published The Catch, the story of fishing in Australia. So welcome, Anna, and thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Al, for having me, and to the HCV as well. I'd just like to acknowledge I'm zooming in from Gadigal country in Sydney and pay my respects to elders past and present, acknowledging them as the traditional owners of this country and traditional storytellers and knowledge sharers, which is apt given what we're no doubt going to be discussing tonight.
Great, thanks, Anna. Look, let's start. Given that your book is about making Australian history, can I start by asking you, Anna, why did you want to make this history and this book?
Well, I suppose the motivation has been a long time coming. I've been really interested in the history wars for a long time and debates about Australian history. And as I studied that over now, I'm sad to say, a couple of decades, it seems like not that long ago, but yeah, and yet, I I became very curious about the fact that although there's this really obvious ebb and flow and sort of increasing contest and generational shifts that have happened in Australian history, I was struck that there wasn't actually an account of that beyond the history wars, say, or beyond, there's been Australian historiography, but nothing that really mapped out Australian history. And so I was very interested in providing a kind of a story for that. But then when I was fortunate enough to get the Future Fellowship from the ARC, the question of how do I actually start and what I actually include, I sort of hadn't really ever thought of that properly. And so as soon as I got the money and sort of, jumped around for joy for a little bit, I thought, where do you begin? Like, what's the beginning of this? Do you begin with Indigenous history making? Do you begin with, what is Australian history? And so the book, I suppose, is a response to this gap that I saw, but in being interested in the gap, it then actually posed really fundamental questions. And rather than providing a discrete answer, I think the book is more a conversation about some of the questions that emerged as I began to think more deeply about it.
Right. Well, let's talk about that, because I think one of the interesting things about the book is the structure of the book and the way you approach Australian history making. And you reflected in the introduction about different ways you could have done this book. Tell us about the approach that you chose and why you chose that structure. Yeah,
so the historiography that I'm most familiar with is a kind of go-to-woe narrative story of history, capital H, Western history. And it, begins with Herodotus and Thucydides and then continues up to more recent historical revisions and perhaps, post-colonialism and maybe decolonization. I didn't want to have this as a very, I didn't want it to just be a narrative of Australian history. And partly that's because that's not what I wanted to read. I didn't want to write something that was, in 1970, feminism, Indigenous rights and civil. I didn't want that to be the style of what this was. And I began to be interested in questions about, what would a historiography have looked like in the late 18th century, or what would a historiography look like in the 19th century? A lot of historiography writes from the present and looks back with the benefit of hindsight. And because history is changing all the time, I sort of wanted to play with who is writing what when. And I became interested in providing a map of Australian, this is the best metaphor I can think of, a map of Australian history making. And we can get to the word making later, perhaps, because what's in and what's out changes. So now we would think that it's de rigueur that oral history is part of, the method of Australian history and making history, but it hasn't always been so. How do we include Indigenous forms of history making? Well, they haven't been included in the sort of Western history canon. And yet, of course, Indigenous people have been making history in Australia and forms of history in Australia for tens of thousands of years. So that I wanted to be able to accommodate that, a more three-dimensional sort of understanding that changes over time, I suppose. And increasingly have been, just in my own kind of interest, bushwalking and thinking about Indigenous histories in particular. What are the archives in the country, for example? What are the sorts of approaches to the past and approaches to history making and historical knowledge that sit outside the methods that I might be more familiar with as an academically trained historian? And so I really wanted the book to wrestle with some of those curlier methodological questions.
Thanks. There's a few things you said I'd like to pick up on, but I guess one is you talked about your walks, and there's a lovely moment, I think it's in the introduction, where you talk about a moment of an epiphany when you're walking the Hawkesbury. Do you want to just tell us about that and what that? Tell us about that.
Yeah, thank you. So I am only part-time, partly because I have school-age children. And apologies, I also have a kitten keeping warm. A little stray we picked up recently. So if he starts meowing, forgive me. And on my days off, I often go snorkeling or I go bushwalking. And I'd heard about this incredible rock platform of engravings near the Hawkesbury. And I contacted Grace Karskens, who very kindly gave me the contact details of someone from the Metropolitan Aboriginal Land Council who might be able to take me to this rock platform. And he did, and it was, a really incredible experience to be in the bush, walking through the bush, and to see these different rock engravings, and most of them are cosmological and spiritual. There's an engraving of Darramulin, and different engravings of kind of spirit creatures, but also on this rock platform is it's fading quickly, but there's a very distinct outline of a woman she's known as a woman in a crinoline dress, the triangular shape of an English dress, with a face, a round head and a face, and she's been engraved next to an emu. And I was thinking, as it's such an incredible, to me, it was like, this is some attempt to incorporate this moment of colonization into an Aboriginal belief system, into, it's a form of history making, and I had no real way of accessing it. And yet, if I'm going to tell the history of Australian history making, surely there's some kind of ethical obligation to try and wrestle with a source like this that's held in stone on country and has, different forms of knowledge. And that was a real pivotal moment, because if I was going to do the sort of go to woe Thucydides to Macintyre, for example, where would the owner or the maker of this piece of history come in, and how? Because we actually don't know the owner, and yet excluding it seems like a graver problem than trying to wrestle with how do we include it, to me. And so I wanted the book to be at least trying to work out how we might incorporate some of these forms of history making that are all around us, right? Here I am in Sydney, a city of 5 million people, and can go and access this piece of history that sits alongside other pieces of history that might be hundreds, if not thousands of years old. The whole thing, you could argue, is a kind of a textbook of sorts. So it's not like I had to go far to find it. Probably took me a little bit longer than going to the State Library, but it's there. And I felt a real ethical obligation to try and incorporate that somehow, without necessarily speaking where I wasn't welcome or wasn't qualified to do so. So yeah, that's another question, I reckon.
Thanks, Anna. I mean, Indigenous history making is all threaded all through the book and different chapters, and might come back to that later, and I'm sure some of our audience will as well. But just to help the audience who haven't read the book get a sense of it, one of the things in the book, you get a sense of the change of history making across time, but you also structure the book thematically with chapters, for example, on nation, memory, colour, country, time, and so on. Tell us about how you decided on those themes.
Yep.
And what you decided to include and so on.
So each of the chapters takes a text, a key, what I maybe I'll overconfidently call a historical text, and look at it both in time and also in place. And they are, as you say, loosely chronological. So there is a kind of a nod to that historiography, traditional historiography, where things are, the texts and the authors come in sequence in time. And there's also a nod to the story of Australian history. It does begin with beginnings, and it goes to contact and convicts. And so it does take a sort of, if you were to open the contents page, it does feel like an Australian history book. But within each chapter with these texts, one of the texts is a piece of contact art, like like the one similar to the one I just mentioned before. Another is a song by a folk song by probably written or not written, but created by a convict, Frank the Poet. And others are more conventional historical texts, such as the one on beginnings is a 1787 history of Australia, which is called The History of New Holland, and another is Creating a Nation by Marilyn Lake and Pat Grimshaw and Marion Quartley and Anne McGrath. So there are, award-winning key Australian history texts in there, but interspersed with those texts are some ones that push at the boundaries of that map that I was talking about before. Where do you put them? Where do you put a poem by Tony Birch, which is very historical in my mind? Where does it sit? Is it in or is it out?
And one of the things that struck me as I was looking at each of those examples is that sometimes some of those we might conventionally think of as sources. Frank the Poet's Moreton Bay song is a source to understand convict history. But what you're doing in the book is saying, yeah, we may use those as sources, but they're also making histories in their own right, in their own time. And they're often, because they're unconventional sources, they're people who don't normally get in the historical archive being able to make their history.
And, there's a danger in that too. There's a danger in being so inclusive that what isn't history? Is it my grandmother's letter to me, or someone talking about their life story on a blog, for example? So I realized that it's not necessarily an easy line to take, but I was always very conscious of what happens when we exclude, and that active curation of who are the national storytellers? Why, if you think about a book like Kate Grenville's Secret River, I think that impacted far more people in terms of Australian historical consciousness than my book will. So where do you put it? It's obviously an influential history text, but it's fiction. So how do we place these? And that question and answer of how do we place these actually changes over time, and that's what I'm really interested in this book. I don't think a Tony Birch poem would be easily placed in the 1800s, but it might be, where people have a more oral culture and where history is can be sung around the pianola. These are all questions about this kind of temporal map that I keep coming back to.
Thanks, Anna. As you talk, I keep thinking of new questions to ask you, but also I just urge the audience to be thinking of the questions you might want to ask, and use the Q&A to start writing in any questions as Anna's speaking, and my colleague Alicia will be gathering those to use in the Q&A. Can I just go back to the book and its time and your making of it? And I'll ask one other question about that, which is, in fact, the last line of the book is, this text represents my present as well as my reflections on history's past. So I'm curious about, what are the aspects, do you think, of your present, indeed of our present, our time, that have been most influential on your thinking about history making?
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess that in terms of historiography, the main question that seems to be facing a lot of us as academic historians today, and more broadly in the Australian community, is questions about reconciliation. And this is not a new challenge. This has been very visibly faced for at least, I'd say, 50 years, if not longer. But it's a growing realization within academic history, I think, that the discipline itself has been part of this problematic national story, and the discipline isn't neutral. We might want it to be, and it certainly has a history of describing itself as a discipline of objectivity and neutrality and truth. But each of those three things, as we look back on, history textbooks from the 19th century right up, throughout the 20th century, is that they are heavily curated, and even prescribed in terms of what version of Australia is being presented. So I suppose it's a consequence of what we might call the cultural turn, which is a potentially poncy academic term, but it does help to describe a growing realization that those of us in the profession have grown up with certain rules that aren't necessarily neutral, and how do we deal with that? How do we use history, the good things about history, or the expansive things about history, to help tell a more nuanced, inclusive national story, and also understand, you have a bit more sort of self-reflection and a bit more self-criticism along the way.
It's as you speak, it sounds like you're saying that actually by looking at how history has been made and the challenges and issues and politics of that, we can become more aware of it and how we're doing it ourselves.
I think we can. And also, one of the things I found really fascinating about researching and writing this book is, by telling history's story, we're actually telling Australia's story. You know, you can look at going back to that quote you pulled out about it being my present. Well, this book is like a mirror of where I'm writing from. But if you pull up a book from the 1950s or the 1920s or the 1830s, each of those is reflecting the present in which they've been written to. And so you can almost trace Australia's presence through the historical texts as they've been written in time, which I think it's been really eye-opening for me. I have increasingly gotten a sense of where Australia is at a point in time or has been at a point in time by looking through some of these texts.
So a book about making Australian history is actually also a book about Australian history.
Yeah.
Really nice things about the book. Just thinking more about the politics of history making, right throughout the book, you explain how the history discipline has been, as you say, part of the architecture of colonisation and of settler Australia's imperial and national project. Can you explain what you mean by that and maybe give us some examples that you use in the book?
Yeah, sure. So if you think about the emergence of the history discipline in the 18th and 19th centuries, I suppose, in an era of colonisation and imperialism, but also scientific enlightenment and knowledge, history moves away from a sort of a more romantic attempt to tell stories and character into a more national, professionalized discipline that becomes more scientific in a sense. And we get a sense of the historical sciences, especially in the second half of the 19th century. And understanding the past helps us understand the truth, and we can get to the heart of the matter by looking at historical sources and so on. And so a lot of these histories that emerge, particularly in the second half of the 19th century, but also earlier to a degree, understand history as this essentially Western form of knowledge it's providential. So it's about progress and inevitability, and it has increasingly strict rules about what is and isn't a historical source, who is and who isn't a historian, and what is and what isn't a sort of a worthy subject of history. So as Australia is colonised over the 19th century, sort of progressively, and as it then towards the end of the 19th century progressively becomes there's a degree of nationalism and national identity, history in parallel is moving towards this increasingly sort of national, professionalised, and discipline, which in a sense, as you say in your question, disciplines the past and creates a sort of a discipline of get all of these unruly facts in order and sort of disciplines them into a sort of a coherent narrative. And so in that process, what sits outside that is of real interest to me. So what sits outside that? Aboriginal Australia sits outside that. So pre-discovery and exploration, Aboriginal history is not only seen to be kind of timeless because there's no way of measuring its time, but it's also seen to be sort of without history, certainly without capital H history. It's sort of seen to be in the dateless backward of time. So by historying Australia from essentially, at a pinch, 1606 onwards, the history discipline essentially diminishes Aboriginal knowledges and forms of history making. And by excluding things like oral history and non-textual forms of history making in terms of art and so on, it excludes Aboriginal knowledges and methodologies from becoming part of Australian history. And that's what I mean by history being sort of part of the architecture of colonisation. It really allowed the story of Australia to tell a very restrictive and constrictive narrative, if you like, which reinforced the sort of colonial apparatus and colonial forms of knowledge. So it was very hard to break into that and to intervene. And until, you know, really the second half of the 20th century, certainly the mid 20th century, that's not to say those forms of history weren't happening. I think, you know, absolutely they are bubbling along, but they weren't really part of Australian history, capital A, capital H, the discipline. They weren't in textbooks, they weren't in school syllabuses, they weren't part of kind of official national commemorations because they were outside history. And it's not just Aboriginal people, of course, it's the domestic life, women's history, you know, everyday forms of history making, histories of the working class, and those histories from below, if you like. It took a long time for them to be included in what we might sort of see now as a more reflective Australian story.
There's a great example in the book where you do just that, and I'm just thinking, because you in the book, clearly by the mid 19th century, that national framework of Australian history is pretty well established, and Aboriginal Australians are written out of that story. But you say that in the chapter on contact, you explore how in those early years of uncertainty and contingency, some of those early settler accounts are really parleying with Aboriginal communities and thinking about and listening to Aboriginal stories. And then you talk about the shift to an indifference to Aboriginal Australia, and you use the 1845 New South Wales Select Committee and the sort of questions they're asking and the assumptions that the commissioners have got about the disappearance of Aboriginal Australians. But then you do what I think is a really wonderful reading of a testimony to that commission by an Aboriginal man called Marut. I wonder if you could tell us about that testimony, how you read that as both a source about Aboriginal experience, but also as a piece of history making in its own right, a sort of subaltern bit of history making.
Yeah, thank you. So there is a real concern in the first half of the 19th century about you know, the effects of colonisation on Aboriginal communities around Australia. And in this 1845 commission is one of a number that happened around this time. And Marut, who was actually born only a couple of kilometres from here on the banks of the Cooks River, took up a fishing, I wouldn't say license, but became a known fisherman in Botany Bay, and was known for taking out little tours for people to go fishing. And so he was a bit of an identity in the neighbourhood, and he was called upon to give evidence in this commission about sort of, you know, why Aboriginal communities were disappearing, and, you know, disease and alcohol and violence, etc. And he was, when you look at the questioning of those commissioners, it seems to be very much, you get a real sense of this shift from those early years where really there's a very strong sense of precarity in the colonies and in colonial history writing. You know, the cows run away, ships crash, the colony is sort of on the verge of starvation, and there's a real, I think Ian Clendinnen talks about this quite beautifully in her book Dancing with Strangers, where there's a kind of a curiosity, and Bill Stanner notes this too, that in the beginning there's this sort of an ethnographic curiosity that occurs, and you can see it in the writing. You know, a lot of colonial journals have great sort of lists of translations at the end of terminology, and wanting to understand and so on. But as the 19th century unfolds, and the colony becomes less precarious, this sense of the inevitability of superiority comes through in a lot of these histories. And Stanner calls it, what does he say? Something about indifference, you know, it's like a culture of indifference begins. So there's not a curiosity, it's just a, you know, Aboriginal people kind of get pushed aside, basically. And in this 1845 commission, I think it shows this turning point where there's a sort of a charitable interest in Indigenous desperation, but at the same time, this pushing, the questions are really pushing about, pushing Marut to give them the answers they want to hear, that Aboriginal people are sort of destined to disappear and destined to die out. And he, in his response, says, well, you know, when you came, we didn't know what you were. We thought you might be possums, you know, clambering up the side of the ships. And so in his mind, it was never inevitable what happened. And so I was interested in how different readings of this history at different points in time understand, I suppose, Australian history and where it might be going to and where it had led to. Because if you compare someone, you know, like Watkin Tench or David Collins from the turn of the 18th century, sort of turn of the 19th century, to some of these later histories in the sort of 1840s, 50s, 60s, it's a really distinct shift between a kind of a wariness and a real precariousness that they are writing about, and then a sense of, well, of course there were, you know, when it becomes much more about racial hierarchy and the destiny of this sort of imperial project. And then that, I think, maps quite interestingly onto the rise of the history discipline, where hierarchies and the sort of science of knowledge and racialization come to form a much bigger part of the history project, I think, in Australia.
I mean, and interestingly, you in the book you write about the emergence of an academic and professional history profession and the disciplining of what historians study, what sources they use. But you also have this really nice notion that runs through about noises from outside, from offstage, if you like, from outside the formal
noises off
discipline. Voices like Marut's,
yep.
about people and groups who are making alternative, if you like, subaltern histories. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about those noises off and their significance. I mean, I was really struck by your use of Frank the Poet in the chapter on convicts, or the use of protests like the 1938 Day of Mourning. Tell us a bit more about those noises off and their significance.
Yeah, actually, Kate Fuluga writes about this really beautifully in her book, which is probably on my shelf somewhere, on the Pacific, a sort of a triple biography on the Pacific about how it wasn't inevitable and the importance of trying to get glimpses, which doesn't diminish the sort of horror of the colonial experience for many Aboriginal peoples, First Nation peoples, but it does sort of disrupt that sort of logic of colonial expansion and imperialism, which if you were to read a 1890 history textbook, there was only one answer, and it's going to end in federation in a couple of years. Like, they even talk about it like that. But I did want to show that history, alternative counter narratives were being produced throughout this time. And I partly wanted to show that because, well, they were there, but also then what that meant for the history discipline and the historians who chose to not include them because it wasn't real history. So there are a number of very striking examples that I found. Some of them are, like important protests, the writing of petitions, and in the little, text of a petition, it might be a little narrative. There's one from Tasmania in, I think the 1860s, 1870s, of saying, we were once many, but now we are few. And that's, to me, that's a little snippet of history, of how people framed their own story. or in the 1938 sesquicentenary in Sydney, where there's this sort of a march, it literally is a march to nationhood. That's how they called it. And it's almost like a march of progress through the streets of Sydney. And yet on the sidelines, on the steps of the town hall in Sydney, is the Aboriginal Day of Mourning protesters who walked then from that point over to Australian Hall and held this day of mourning. And in the booklet of the Day of Mourning, I mean, by their actions, they're sort of producing a counter-narrative of history by saying, you know, is this really a march of progress, and whose progress and for whom? But in the little booklet, there's a counter-narrative of, you know, you might call this a wonderful country and a nation of progress, but who's it for really? You know, we have been trodden on, and we demand a voice, and we demand inclusion in the sort of national story. I found that to be very, you know, literally in the official history of the sort of sesquicentenary, they called Sydney the second whitest city in the empire after London, the second largest white city in the empire after London. And yet here is this very strident protest, saying, you know, that disrupts that convenient pride, if you like, and says, hang on a minute, who's this for? Who's this progress for? We're not experiencing it. And I was also, with thanks to Billy Griffiths, who found this from me in the Stannah archives, when Stannah wrote his incredible 1968 Boyer lectures, there was a response by Ian Moody, who I think was a part of a literary society in Melbourne, and he said, he wrote, you know, thank you for your lectures, they're very powerful, but with all due respect, the silence isn't everywhere. It might be among the historians, but among my cohort, which are the artists and writers and creative practitioners, there's actually increasing noise being made. And if you think of books like Xavier Herbert's Capricornia, which is published in 1938, and other books that are published, Eleanor Dark, Timeless Land, there are rumblings, not to mention the whispers and whisperings that are happening around colonial violence and the stories of Aboriginal child removal that are being faithfully handed down through families via oral histories and so on. So it's out there, but why? When do these, you know, when do these difficult histories start entering into the kind of historical canon or the lexicon, if you like? And I'm interested in that moment as well, those moments, because it doesn't happen at once, obviously.
Thanks, Anna. We've got about 5 minutes before we open up to Q&A. So just a reminder to people to be writing your questions into the Q&A section. Just changing direction for now, Anna. You note in the book that many of Australia's most popular and probably influential histories are not written by academically trained professional historians, but rather often by journalists, people like Peter Fitzsimmons, for example. And I guess for me, that poses the question, what then do you see as the specific contribution of professional and academic historians?
I think there are a number of things, and maybe this, you know, I think actually, I hope this book isn't just a put down of academic history. I hope it's also a defense of what's good about it, because there's a lot that we have inherited from the Enlightenment and from, you know, disciplinary practices from the 19th century that I think still speak to the sort of potency of history as a form of knowledge and a form of kind of critical inquiry, if you like. And one of these are perhaps skills as much as content. And if you think of, you know, the best of scientific history is a demand for source inquiry and source criticism, if you like, that you get a historical source and you ask questions, you know, who wrote it, when was it written, why, who's it for? These are still questions that we need to ask, and sometimes we don't have answers, and that's the nature of history. But being able to ask these questions for our sources is really important. And so I think, you know, academic historical training, be it in school or in university, is important for that reason. I also think it's really important to be able to distinguish certain different historical perspectives and to evaluate. You know, reading a blog is not the same as reading a book, and this is also another really important skill that requires training. It's not necessarily intuitive. I mean, my kids come at me and say, "Oh, on YouTube I saw blah blah blah." Well, it's like, okay, children, you know, who wrote it, why have they said it, and so on. And that doesn't mean that someone like a Peter Fitzsimons doesn't ask those questions, but I think that the training that comes from studying history in school and university does provide those forms of critical inquiry and historical thinking that it's very important. At the same time, you know, history is about story, and it requires good storytelling, and maybe there's something for all of us to learn from in terms of why certain things are popular and why certain things aren't, and helping, you know, being good teachers and being good writers is something that you know, we should be thinking about as well.
Thanks. I mean, just following on that theme of our role as professional or academic historians, is in the chapter on gender, you write wonderfully about the creation of the book Creating a Nation, a sort of feminist history of Australia, and you actually get a little bit nostalgic about how in 1994 there was the sort of strength and collectiveness to generate this extraordinary collaborative project. And then you talk about, well, a generation later, we're facing, as you say, a wave of university redundancies, mass casualisation, and government attacks on the humanities. And so it gets hard to do history in universities in the 2020s.
Yeah, it sure does.
Given that, you know, fairly grim context, where do you see hope and opportunity for your generation of trained historians?
Yeah, well, in a moment where we've just been recently instructed that we're supposed to all be moving to hot desking soon, and I'm wondering what that will mean for being able to write and research. It's certainly a prescient question, and huge thanks to Pat and Marilyn and Marion and Anne for. I was able to interview them on Zoom for that chapter, and actually that's what gave me this sort of shot of nostalgia, because I looked at the four of the little pictures on Zoom and I sensed this sort of fabulous conversation that had obviously been happening for a very long time, but I was getting a sense of what that moment was of possibility. You know, we can change this, we can do this, we can shift ideas and change knowledges, and it's you know, it feels hard. It feels hard to do when you're under attack from the government for being un-Australian, as if school teachers and university academics go into it because we want to make Australia a worse place, or, you know, it's just sort of mind-boggling, and it feels very hard to be pushing back against the sort of neoliberal university and government all at once. It feels like there are lots of barriers to just sort of doing what you love, to be honest, and having a sense of that. But in terms of where our generation and where I see it going, I actually think that those bigger questions about and they're not unique to our generation, but the questions that our generation of historians are asking and answering now about the ethics of what makes good history and why is it needed are actually timeless ones. And the fact that we are still able to ask them and answer them, even if we're, you know, working from home or at a hot desk, shows the sort of the relevance of historiography as an approach to understanding the past. That it's not simply, you know, it's not just about understanding sources or you know, the past itself, but that history, understanding interpretation and the doing of history is just as important, and I think is a site for really fruitful discussion, particularly as we are more aware, I think, of what it means to practice history in a settler colonial society.
Thanks, Anna. Look, as we expected, I've got a lot more questions than we've had time for in our part of this conversation, but I'm going to hand over now to my colleague Alicia Soretto, who's going to chair the Q&A with Margie Anderson and myself in the background, checking questions and helping Alicia. So thanks very much, Anna, and I'll come back in at the end. But over to you, Alicia, to chair the Q&A.
Thanks, Al. Thanks, Anna, for such a far-reaching conversation with
Sorry,
Al.
I totally waffled on then.
I think our audience is loving it because there's loads of questions that have come in for you. And it's really interesting to me, just reading some of the questions already, is how much it taps into, in particular, what you were just saying then when you were sort of reflecting on history teaching, but also what are those political influences and frustrations that are there, as well as, like you say, the doing of history. So I might start with a question from Georgina. Georgina Fitzpatrick asks us, do you think that the politicians might stop their culture war attacks on history teaching in schools and the national curriculum? Will the change of government bring some relief, and what will Peter Dutton do?
I actually think that the attacks on history teachers is directed to an ever diminishing audience. And I think in the lead up to the last federal election, sort of towards the end of last year, when it was Alan Tudge and then Stuart Robert was saying that Anzac shouldn't be in the national curriculum as contested. I just think that most Australians have kind of don't even regard that as problematic, to be honest. And certainly the importance of teachers in this discussion is now, let's leave it to the teachers. They know what they're doing. I think that has pretty much accepted. Like, I honestly think that sort of that ship might have sailed in terms of, that's not to say the attacks aren't coming, but the traction that they have in the broader community, I just don't think that's a big issue. And as perhaps as the election results showed, it felt like it was sort of a bit desperate, and it didn't really have much to stand on, because like everyone knows, grandparents can't even agree on what happened. So why should we expect a nation to agree on what happened?
And following on, or sticking with politics, Margie Anderson asks us, I wondered if you might be interested in commenting on the current federal exercise to develop a new Australian cultural policy. So many have been struck by the apparent absence of history from official references to the making of Australian culture, which is often defined narrowly in terms of the arts. Are there positive things that historians might do to lift the profile of history as cultural capital?
Yeah, I hadn't even thought of that, to be honest, but obviously there's a real demand for history as storytelling, and for history as a way for us to define ourselves, not only individually in terms of the boom in family history, but also in our communities, but also nationally and collectively. Hence the huge purchase of popular histories, because people want stories that speak to them about where we come from. So I absolutely agree that there's a place there for historians to step into and illuminate Australia's culture and aspirationally, but also historically. I think often history is pushed aside from those creative or cultural kind of grab bags. And that can be a challenge. The 19th century historians would probably agree, because it was a science, but even science is cultural, so there you go.
There you go. And again, we've got a question from Angela here talking about the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and she says Anthony Albanese has pledged to implement the Uluru Statement from the Heart in full, which would include truth-telling. What do you see as the potential for a shift in the making and telling of Australian history arising from the collection and use of knowledge in a truth-telling process?
Yeah, thank you. I had a really interesting chat, a really lovely chat with my colleague, Larissa Barron, who's an Aboriginal lawyer and historian and fiction writer, and she was asking me about this book. And I was sort of describing it to her and kind of getting caught up in knots. And I said, I think ultimately the book wonders or grapples with whether history can decolonize. You know, I understand that it has been part of the colonial project, but can it be part of the next chapter of Australia's identity? And she said, well, you've got to give it a go, don't you? And I think that's a real, you know, characteristically generous from her, but it's a sense of, yes, history can be part of this story making project and this restoring of Australia and this ever changing process of interpretation.
Yeah. I really was struck by that point that you were making both in the book and tonight, where you talk about, you know, the changing interpretation of history. If someone like you was writing your book 100 years ago, what that might look like, and the thoughts you might, you know, or conclusions you might draw. And there's a couple of questions here. Someone's hearkening back to Geoffrey Blainey's The Triumph of the Nomads in the early 1970s. And for this person, for Deb, she said, can you comment on the significance, if any, you see in the publication of that book? And for her, it was the first book addressing Indigenous history that she read, and was certainly the beginning of lifelong search and research.
I think it was for him too. And when I read it now, I need to have my, you know, with my historical thinking skills cap on, I need to have empathy for when he was writing it, which is sort of, you know, really at a sort of a turning point in Australian history. And he was a, I don't want to use the word pioneer, but I'm trying to think of another word for sort of at the forefront of that changing discussion in Australia. But also now looking at it, I see certain things about that text that are probably problematic in today's eyes. But for Deb, I recently read Blainey's autobiography, and in it he talks about going on an archaeological dig with Mulvaney and at Fromm's Landing, and it was the first time they used carbon dating in Australia. And Blainey went along with Mulvaney because he had a car, and that was really convenient to be, you know, lugging all the stuff over for the dig. But for him, it was absolutely earth-shattering in terms of how he saw us, how Blainey saw Australia. And he writes in his memoir that you know, here was a civilization in Australia, you know, fishing and creating a community at the time when Rome was nothing more than a paddock. And so for him, it kind of shifted the balance of the planets, the historical planets, the alignment of the historical planets. And obviously that then led to Triumph of the Nomads. And he was wanting to sort of story Australia. And it's at the same time as this sort of archaeological groundswell is happening about storying Australia, shifting that beginning point of Australian history and pushing it back so that's not prehistory. It's not something that happens before the real history. How do we tell this as part of this continent's human story? And I think that's really important to remember. Yeah, thank you for that answer. Thinking about the lands that we're on, and we've got a question about environmental history, and Terry Seddon says, given climate change, do you address environment and history making associated with as a theme in your book? And can you give an example of this practice of history making in relation to the historiography of the earth? Oh, that's a great question. I don't know if I specifically mentioned the word climate change, but it is something that I'm wanting to look at in my next project. So it's it's very timely. But it does address climate change of a sort, because I was very struck by Indigenous accounts of climate change 10,000 years ago. And there are oral records of Port Phillip Bay filling in, for example, with water after the end of the last ice age. So there's obviously great, that record and that oral account to me is such a sort of an interesting archive that tells us about Australia. But of course, you know, the environmental history of Australia is one of very changing attitudes to landscape and country. And one of the things I found really interesting is that just as the sort of understanding of Australia as sort of an empty land or awaiting colonisation or awaiting development, that attitude to the country mirrored the sort of attitude to its history. That, you know, you could extract from the country that country was about progress and development, and meanwhile that's how histories were written for a long time. And then as views started shifting around Australia's environmental history about, you know, that actually this is actually a very delicate balance, and questions of sustainability also is mirrored in shifting right ways that Australian history is written, that country isn't just a place that history happens on, but that country actually is part of the history and is an agent in history. And I think that will have an increasing presence in Australian historiography. I mean, it already does. I'm not saying anything new here, but I think that sort of that sense of the country, capital C country, but also in a scientific sense as an archive of the Australian story is becoming increasingly important.
I loved in the book how you shared how you grappled with trying to explain the concept of country to a colleague, and you were trying to you couldn't imbue enough meaning in it in English, I felt.
Yes, that's right. It feels I feel completely unqualified to do that. I was attending a really interesting conference in China at the time, and I sat next to a translator who was in the middle of translating Bill Gamage's Biggest Estate on Earth, and he sort of turned to me and he said, "I do have a question for you." He said, "What is this word country? What does it mean?" And I just sort of sat there for the rest of the dinner. Felt like I was, you know, dumplings are sort of falling out of my mouth. I had I just felt completely inadequate to explain it in English, what capital C country might mean, let alone how that might translate into Chinese. And I'm not the first to wrestle and probably fail with that active translation.
Yeah. We've got a wonderful question here from James Warner, who said, did the structure of your book, or the fab structure of your book, present any limitations or forced compromises you didn't anticipate, or which didn't allow your desired historiographical reach?
Oh, that's a really good question. And hello, James. Nice to hear from you. Yeah, that's nothing that leaps out. There were a few things that I would like to have had in there. I would like to have had a little bit more of a regional emphasis and a sense of how different communities around Australia and different areas there might be sort of a regional specificity and a rural specificity to history writing. But it took so long. It took 7 or 8 years to write this and do this, and once I had the sort of structure in mind, it just was going to be what it was going to be. And I always sort of thought, you know, how can you do this and cover everything? So I stopped being precious and just allowed it to be one contribution, and there will be many others to come, I'm sure. And tonight, we've heard the word storytelling a lot, and sort of thinking about how we tell history and what the connection is with our readers or our audience. And Helen Penrose asks, or says, academic history programs rarely teach excellence in written storytelling. A postgrad student might pick up tips if they happen to luck onto a great supervisor. And you were saying a good writer is important. And is there something you would suggest that would train historians to write accessibly and for a general audience? That is such a good question. Of course, all of my students are,
of course,
trained, and I was very fortunate to have the instructive words of Stuart Macintyre. I remember so strongly, like he would write UGH in the margins of my drafts with an exclamation mark.
Yeah.
So and also my honours supervisor, Penny Russell, gave me a very strict rule of not writing sentences that are more than 3 lines long. So I do find myself repeating these sort of mantras from my supervisors of shorten your sentences, don't use jargon. But there's a kind of, I suppose, I don't know why this is, but there is absolutely a kind of an academic, in academies, a kind of cleverness, of a performing cleverness, which infuriates me. And maybe because I'm not clever enough, but I find it very hard to read that sort of stuff. I guess because it's quite competitive, academia, like lots of professions, you do have to sort of put yourself out there and sort of show how you're getting ahead and show that you're making new contributions to knowledge. So that could be a sort of a structural problem with how do you become, new knowledge creators. There's a sort of an incentive to sort of write in that way. But I have to agree with, sorry, I've forgotten the name of
Helen.
Helen, I really have to agree with Helen's question there, that it's problematic, and in fact it does the profession no service really when we are trying to show the importance of history and trying to get students engaged and trying to get the broader public engaged in what we do and its potential.
Yeah, and it's sort of maybe for some left to seek it out themselves if they need to.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, maybe Helen's right that actually having a, compulsory subject in any postgraduate course should be academic writing, how to be a successful academic writer. I really enjoyed reading Anne McGrath and Anne Curthoy's How to Write History that people want to read. I think that's a great...
Behind me as well, yeah.
Oh, right, yeah. I think that's really
great.
useful. And in fact, I should just buy 50 copies and give them to all my students.
Yeah.
But when I am setting out to write, and I'm an aspiring writer rather than a successful writer, I would say, I like to read really good writers. And they don't have to be historians, they don't have to be Australian historians. I just like to kind of every night read a few pages of somebody who just writes really short sentences and is very kind of clear, but also doesn't lose that transporting element of history, that sort of imaginative leap, which is so sort of wonderful about why we do what we do.
Yeah, and I think, yes, if anyone is listening, that Curthoy's McGrath book is fantastic. And I did do it as part of my master's, I think. So that must have been part of our public history course, I think, back then. But like you say, reading and absorbing, even if you don't realise you are, perhaps.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. And so thinking a little bit about other writers beyond the academy. There's a question about, in the book, you've reflected on the contribution of creative writers like Tony Birch or Kate Grenville, as you've mentioned tonight, who take imaginative leaps when they write about the past. Though you conclude that historians can't just make it up, you also suggest that sometimes historical imagination is required to understand the past. And can you give us some examples of what you mean by that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I would say historical imagination is always required, actually. And Marnie Hughes-Warrington, who's a philosopher of history, has written a book about this, which she calls about wonder, understanding the wonder in history. And she describes it as, those old, I can't even remember what they're called, they're sort of the first form of animation where it's a disc of little slides of a horse running, and when you whiz it around you can actually see the horse running. When you do it fast enough, it feels like a little animation. But of course, in between those stills of the horse there's a gap, and we're almost having to join those dots together. So I think there is a lot of dot joining in history that is educated and skilled dot joining, but sometimes you just have to say, look, I'm guessing that this happened, or I assume this happened. And And it's in those kind of gaps where you are making leaps of imagination about, what might it have felt like to be here? That's very powerful. And I think Mark McKenna talks about this too, where there's an urge to do that we act, and Ian Clendenin, there's an urge to do that, which is really sort of some of the wonderful aspects of history, but we also have to bear in mind that they aren't us. And Greg Denning once said that the past isn't us in funny clothes. So while I'm always thinking about, oh God, what would it have been like to give birth in a tent on the goldfields? That really transporting question. What would it have been like to sort of come through Sydney Heads and see Sydney Harbour? And you kind of get a glimpse of it if I'm standing on a ferry, but I don't really. So those leaps of imagination are actually very important and very powerful, but they should be tempered by a constant conversation about what do we know and what do we don't know. And that doesn't mean we can't make them, but we just, as historians, I think we do always have to be sort of thinking, how do I know this, or what's the limit of my knowledge here?
And a question here, if you're willing to answer it, about bad history. One of our audience members, Robert Renton, says, opening up to new or other forms of history in contrast with academic history raises the question for him, which is there bad history, and what might the criteria be? That's
a really good question. And I guess it goes back to the point I was making earlier about, the sort of ethical obligation to open it up. But what doesn't it include? Does everything go? And I suppose that comes back to an earlier question that somebody had about how do we teach history, and what's the use of history? What's the purpose? I think it's really important, as well as teaching what happened, to be teaching these historical thinking skills that help us evaluate different forms of history making. And some of them are neither bad nor good, they're just different, but some of them are less informed, or there's less scholarship, or there's sort of they come with a strong political motivation, which doesn't make them bad, but I think we do need to ensure, when we're teaching history in schools and universities, that capacity to critically evaluate different forms of history making, so that we can make some of those decisions and sort of keep our catalogue robust.
And there's a question from someone who is asking, Marianne Hicks says, historical context is so important. How would you advise teachers to incorporate historiography into our historical context in school classrooms?
Oh, that's a great question. And hello, Marianne. When I often, if I'm visiting schools, I often ask students, what are the 5 things that you need that you absolutely would like to see taught in every school about Australian history, and I get them to sit in groups and do that. And of course, inevitably they can't agree on 5. Maybe one group can, but then compare it to the other group and they can't. They've got 7, or they've got 9, or they've got 10. And then I say, okay, so for that reason, one of the things I think should be in every Australian history curriculum is historiography, so that you can understand how you can't agree on 5, and why, I'm 43, why am I prioritizing this and you're prioritizing that? We're of different generations. And so actually historiography should be, I think, one of the really important foundations of history education, as well as context and content, historical skills, and historiography.
Yes. And we've appreciated your advocacy, that I've seen around history education, and that support for teachers. And, I think going into classrooms, one of my children is doing colonial Australia, and doing that again.
My kids hate history. They're like, oh, we have to go and see that.
Mom.
I definitely can't have tickets on myself, that's for sure.
No, well, there's that, isn't it? Yep. Well, following on from that, Alison says, given that you are pointing out that history is a contested field of knowledge, what do you think is its value?
I think there are three sort of really important aspects of history. The contested part comes from one of them, but the first one is, one of the important things about history is, to go back to Marianne's point, context. You know, context and content. This is a very sort of civics-minded answer, but it's really, it is useful to know how we got to where we are, and to understand the world around us. Like I can't imagine understanding today's world without understanding the Holocaust, for example, or the Vietnam War, or the Soviet Union, or the Cold War, or colonization in Australia. So there's an important content, and sometimes that content, you just have to learn it. And, you know, it's a bit like learning your times tables. It can be a little bit boring. Hopefully it can be transporting and open your imagination, but sometimes you just have to know stuff. The second part of that is a historical skills answer. And I think history's value comes in the sort of skills that it helps foster. And that's not unique to history. Other subjects can do it, but history does it really well. And that's going back to those sort of questions about source criticism, critical inquiry, research skills, communication skills and writing, sort of contest and contrast about, you know, because history is something we do. So understanding why people disagree about the past, understanding how historical interpretation changes over time. And the third one is a sort of I suppose it's a consciousness. It's sort of an answer about the importance of historical consciousness, understanding that we are also people in time. You know, we study people in time, and we try and understand, you know, why someone might have signed up to volunteer to fight in World War I. What were their motivations? What was their life? Or why someone might have come out to the goldfields, or why someone might have had to give up a child. But we are also in time. It's not just us making decisions about the past. And for us to understand that we are also in time, and that people will be making historical judgments about us, is also really important.
Yeah. And we've got a great question here from Ellen Coates, talking about libraries and archives, and saying what role do you think libraries and archives play in the creation of history, as both the source of the sources, but also as part of the same colonial structures as history as a profession?
Yes, that's such a great question.
Yeah.
And of course, both of those things are true. You know, where would we be without libraries? I couldn't do my job.
Yeah.
And yet, when you go into those libraries, what stories don't they include, and whose knowledges don't they include? And obviously that's changing with every year and with every decade, and changing very rapidly in terms of discussions about, you know, what is knowledge and what should be kept and what is an archive. But it also raises really important questions about, you know, if there is an archive on country, for example, what role do libraries have in negotiating that space and accessing that space and so on. So like a lot of these questions of what it means to be producing historical interpretations and knowledge in 2022 in Australia, with our sort of increasing awareness of where we have come from in a settler colonial society, it also raises questions, as well as hopefully resolving some of those tensions and ethical conundrums.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's so much ongoing work happening in different spaces. You know, I'm thinking about museums as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, and sometimes I guess I'm not a librarian, but my sense is, as somebody who's library adjacent, that sometimes those of us who are in this space of knowledge keeping have to actually sort of step back and listen and take advice from others.
Yeah, yeah. We've got a question here from Peter McPhee, and he's asking you. You spoke about the methodology of Australian academic history making being part of the Western Nation Building Project, and how can it be written differently? It's not just about including different, perhaps unsettling points of view, which is vitally important, but also about making claims to historical veracity.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's a great question, Peter. Thank you. I think one of the interesting things about the history discipline is its capacity to absorb and adopt and adapt. And so while, in this book, I have been quite kind of consciously critiquing the discipline for its curation, which I think has been, looking back on it, has been really problematic. It's also been notable for what it has changed and what is sort of absorbed. And if you think of feminist history, it hasn't just added women and stirred, as the old adage goes. It's actually fundamentally changed methods about how we do history and what is a historical source and who is a historian and what is a worthwhile historical narrative. It's changed sort of the methods of how we do what we do. And you could make similar claims for, post-colonialism and Indigenous forms of history making. And there's always a sort of an interesting kind of, I suppose, question as to, what can it absorb and when does it stop being what it is? And I think those questions will keep being asked and answered, but in terms of, I think there is a model there for history changing, particularly in the last sort of couple of generations, to very rapidly incorporate different methods and approaches, more than simply just adding more voices to the story. And that's what I have found most interesting. I mean, if you think of some of, histories of the Pacific, for example, where like Apeli Hauofa and Tracy Bannervanua talking about needing to find different threads and look beyond the sources which are so kind of colonial and incomplete. How do we find new sources and how do we include new forms of storytelling or different forms of storytelling in our own practice? And I think history, that discussion around history has been it's obviously been very difficult at times, but it's also been very creatively productive as well.
Yeah. And I think that's a great challenge for all our audience members who might be working in history and, exploring all of that. And I think your book gives us a great sparking off point, perhaps, for whether it's about, sources or our research, or then how we're communicating it and thinking about where it fits in. And there's a question here. You're talking about how your research about history making may have affected how you've made history in your career and how it might affect your history making down the track. And particularly, thinking about your sort of focus on fishing in your book, The Catch.
Yeah.
So I wonder, how have you seen that in your own work?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. It's made me think, as somebody who's, I really love being in Australia and I love studying Australian history and I love the Australian landscape. It's made me realise that I'm not necessarily trained to read the Australian landscape. And I would like to. And in fact, I'm taking long service leave next year to study archaeology. So that gives you an indication of where I'd like to change in the future. And I'm increasingly interested in some of that sort of landscape as archive and the stories that are held in the landscape around us, and how do we access that to try and tell environmental histories, but also cultural and social histories. So that's a space I would increasingly like to turn to. However dilettantishly, but I'd like to get better at that, become a more, I don't know, capacious reader of Australian sources. Unashamedly parochial, but it's kind of where I get historical nourishment from, I suppose.
I think it's that idea too of the polymath, or maybe sometimes it's the joy of being the historian, is there's such scope in what we can work on. So perhaps, you know, being able to focus on archaeology or looking at environmental history at the same time as you've, you know, as you've displayed in your different books, you know, you've got these sort of deep interests that you've been able to explore.
Yes.
It taps into in the book where you write about emotion in history and the emotions of the historian and how important it is for us to acknowledge our emotional and subjective investment in the histories we make. So how do you see that in yourself? If you're happy to answer that, how do emotions either drive or hinder your historical work?
Yeah. I think they, you know, I suppose they do both, and maybe it's similar to those leaps of imagination that we take. You know, we're wanting to sort of step into the past, but also we need to think about what are the limits of that leap. For me, emotion works in similar ways, where I can be, you know, totally profoundly moved, and I think this book really clarified for me that sort of the power of our own personal ethics and the sort of the ethical challenge of doing trying to produce an Australian history that doesn't reinforce some of those, you know, lines of inequality and hierarchy. And I've been very driven by that, but I'm also aware that, you know, I might still sort of be repeating the problems of history by writing about it. So yeah, it's when you're caught, when emotions have a motivation, obviously, but they also can make you. I don't want to necessarily feel like I'm failing either, because I'm bound up in this. Yeah. Maybe that's why I'm moving to wanting to try it, have a break next year and get some dirt in my hands and just forget about it for a while.
Yeah, get, you know, that physicality of it as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And I think you explore that tension quite well in your book, where you know, you're not trying to tell us that you know everything. You're taking us on the journey. But I should say I listened to your book. I had the audio book, which meant for anyone who hasn't seen that, is that Anna read it to me essentially. So it was really interesting to hear a book in that way and to hear your own intonations.
Oh, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
It was a very kind of, I've never done that before, obviously, but it was quite, I reckon I read every sentence about 3 times, you know, just to get it. It's quite hard to, you sort of think, oh yeah, I've read my book, that'll be easy, but reading it out, it is quite a different process. So I'm glad it worked.
Yeah, I find it quite a good, it's been new to me, probably
not too soporific.
Year. No, not at all. Not at all. I was marching around doing things. So I recommend it to anyone. And I'm sure that lots of people tonight, having heard the conversation, will be very keen to look at it. And I can see some comments in that vein. So it's left with me now to wrap up and to thank you very much, Anna, for your conversation, and to Al, who was in conversation with you. We really appreciated that discussion and far-reaching, really, exploration of making Australian history. So it was a bit of a treat for us to turn making public histories into making Australian history tonight. And to all of our audience as well, who contributed so many questions for this second part of the evening.
Oh, thank you. Thanks to all the questions and to the really fantastic moderation, and Al for the making me think about stuff I hadn't thought about. So thank you. It's always nice to reflect on something that's been a big part of your life. And go history.
Go history. That's really fantastic. We want to thank the team, so Monash History, the History Council of Victoria, and of course our old Treasury building. We put these events together as a team. So thanks to all the team behind the scenes. as well as our sponsors, Monash University Publishing, who supply us with a lovely book for each of our speakers each time we run one of these seminars. And there was so much talk about environmental histories tonight. I feel rapt that we are going to have 3 wonderful environmental historians in conversation for our next event. Katie Holmes, Andrea Gaynor and Ruth Morgan, and that's on the 22nd of September. And they'll be in conversation as well on doing environmental history in urgent times. So book for that one, anyone who's in the audience and keen to hear more about environmental history. Any last words, Anna or Al?
Thanks very much, Anna. It's been lovely talking with you about it, and I'm inspired.
Thank you both. It's really been a great pleasure.
That's wonderful. Well, thanks to all of you for your attendance, your interest and participation, and we look forward to having you with us again for Making Public History. So thank you and good night.